as we hear about Russia and our democracy under threat, but there's barely been any media coverage. You, I think last year, sued Broward County because a not small amount of the ballots in your 2016 primary race against Debbie Wasserman Schultz were thrown out. And Politico of all places, wrote a piece basically pointing this out, that this is against election law.
That's right.
I haven't seen anything about it. I actually read a Sun Sentinel piece about your decision to run third party, and they didn't even mention that. They mentioned it as like, well, Canova alleges, even though it's not an alleged, it happened.
Right.
Okay, before we get into your decision, take us through that, because not a lot of people know about that.
I agree. It's been a news blackout, much the way Bernie Sanders had to deal with a mainstream news blackout during his campaign. When our race ended in August of 2016, we had some concerns that the official results didn't seem to match with what our expectations were based on what I thought were very good field numbers. We had an enormous field operation, knocking on 10 to 12,000 doors a week, phoning another 2,000 or 3,000 voters every week, and ranking the voters. So the official results seemed suspect. And then I started to hear from a lot of election integrity folks, some of whom had studied the results, and they found them unbelievable as well. So we put in a public records request. Florida has a very good public records law, and ballots are considered public records. And it should have been a no-brainer that we should have been able to inspect the ballots. Instead, the supervisor of elections of Broward County stonewalled us for more than half a year, and I brought a lawsuit last June to ask the court to allow us to exercise our rights under not just Florida's public records law, but it's actually enshrined in the Constitution in Florida. So any citizen, you don't have to be a candidate or a former candidate, should be able to inspect these public records. While the lawsuit was pending is when they actually destroyed the ballots, which is absolutely outrageous. And they didn't destroy a certain percentage of the ballots, they destroyed all of the paper ballots completely. We recently conducted depositions of the supervisor of elections and some of her top lieutenants, and it was quite revealing. The supervisor admitted that they destroyed the ballots in violation of federal law, which requires them to maintain the ballots for 22 months. She gave the lame excuse that it was all just a mistake. She was then asked, how could you sign this destruction order that certified that the ballots were not the subject of any pending litigation? And she said, well, yes, I did sign that destruction order. Yes, it did certify that, but I had no idea what I was signing. I sign anything that's put in front of my face. And that's where the case is right now. And it was, in many ways, the last straw for me. I was independent. So for the Sun Sentinel to hardly mention it is really incredible. I mean, I gave a 40-minute announcement as to why I was running as an independent, and we discussed a lot of the issues facing voters every day. But the first 20 minutes of this talk, I think, was all about the ballot destruction and nothing else. But that's the Sun Sentinel for you. They are part of, I think, the second largest newspaper chain in the country. And when it comes to covering our race, I'm sure they take their orders from corporate headquarters 1,000 miles away.
And what's really interesting to me is, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, obviously, I mean, I don't make any bones about it. If I lived in your district, I would be voting for you. I think she's really a face of everything wrong with not just the Democratic Party, but politics in general. But let's say, for example, those ballots weren't thrown out, and let's say it shows that something nefarious went on in that election. And let's say you won, or let's say you only lost by 3 or 4 points rather than, I believe, 12 was the final count. That's a whole different ballgame. That changes not just your momentum for a re-election campaign. Let's say, for argument's sake, you only lost by a few points. It helps with fundraising. It helps actually with you getting endorsements because it's not you just barely lost to her in that scenario. It helps a lot of progressives who might want to run for office, but say, oh, it's hopeless. Even Tim Canova, who is the most noteworthy down ballot candidate in 2016, he lost by 12 points. So there's a lot of ramifications, not just that it's undemocratic, but we don't really know how much you lost by or if you actually lost.
Well, that's right. No doubt this is an attempt. They've been trying to discredit our campaign from the moment we announced we were running 2 years ago. Now they say, well, let me back up and say when we first put in the public records request in November of 2016, they said they had not done any digital scanned images of the ballots, which struck us as very strange because really it doesn't take much. It's a matter of, flipping a switch to have the scanning machines actually take ballot images. A year later, when they admitted that they had destroyed the paper ballots, they then said, well, we actually do have digital scanned images after all. So you don't really know what to believe. And the election experts I talk to, they say without the paper ballots to compare them with, the digital scanned images are pretty much worthless, that you can alter them by manipulating the software of the scanning machines. So they could have engineered any result that they wanted. And there are a lot of election justice, election integrity folks who have studied these issues much more than me. Fractional voting, flipping votes. There's so easy to hack into these machines. You don't have to be all the way in Russia to do this. It's outrageous. To me, it's been a big education. I think the only way to have an election system that's transparent and verifiable is to do what we did for 200 years in this country, which is to have 100% paper ballots that are counted by hand in public on election night and reported immediately at the local precinct level on election night. All over Western Europe, countries have banned the electronic voting machines because they know they can be hacked. They know the software can be manipulated. The United States ranks dead last among major democracies for election integrity. And what would it really take to conduct an election system the way I described? The federal government just gave a $1.5 trillion tax cut. It gives tens of billions of dollars of subsidies, hundreds of billions every year to corporate America. The Federal Reserve has given trillions of dollars of subsidies to these big Wall Street banks. It would probably cost just a few $billion to employ ordinary Americans in whatever numbers are required, 100,000 of them, whatever's required, to count ballots in public by hand on election night and to make sure that we have real honest elections. But, Congress doesn't do that. They haven't yet. The companies that run these electronic voting machines have a lot of political clout, and the incumbents don't want to rock the boat. After all, it's a system that officially anointed them as winners of their elections.
Right. Before I get to the latest, where you're running as an independent, just bigger scale. I've been hearing and watching this hyperventilation now for over 2 years. It's exhausting with everything from Russia hacked the Vermont electrical grid to Russia hacked the 2016 election. Now unnamed officials say they hacked voting machines, but nothing was stolen. But literally you have a case right there in South Florida of confirmed, not Russia, a supervisor of elections who, if I'm not mistaken, is kind of in the Debbie camp. Debbie Wasserman Schultz camp. Her name
yes, in a big way. Yes.
Brenda Snipes. But there's barely anything on that. I think I know why, but I'd like to know your opinion, because that's real. If we have a democracy, that's a real attack on democracy that is crickets.
Yes. I know. Do we have the rule of law? Do we have equal justice under the law in this country? And I've been critical for years that the Justice Department, when it was headed by Eric Holder, never brought a single criminal prosecution against any high-level banker for a multi-trillion-dollar fraud on the American public that collapsed our economy. no real criminal investigation done there. So what does that tell you about equal justice under the law? Here, yes, you're absolutely right. Brenda Snipes, the supervisor of elections, is clearly in the Wasserman Schultz camp and has been for a while. Her top lieutenant, who destroyed all the ballots and carried out the destruction order, Mr. Dozell Spencer, had not one but two framed photographs of himself standing with a politician on the shelf of his office. Just one politician with two framed photographs of him with her, and that was Debbie Wasserman Schultz. No explanation as to why Debbie and nobody else. And then the lawyer for Brenda Snipes, in our litigation, offered to give the court an affidavit from Wasserman Schultz to help try to stop the litigation, and the judge rightly declined that offer. So why would Debbie Wasserman Schultz be trying to stop a public records request? What is it she's afraid of? There should certainly be a criminal investigation of this and of other frauds on the public. I've been speaking out about the kinds of election rigging and voter suppression and purging of voter rolls that occurred in the Democratic primaries against Bernie Sanders in 2016. New York City is maybe the most notable one because they pretty much admitted. The New York City Board of Elections last October admitted in a civil consent decree that they had purged more than 200,000 citizens from the voting rolls in the days leading up to the Sanders-Clinton primary. And in that consent decree, they promised they would never do it again. And that's supposed to be enough to just say, okay, let's let bygones be bygones. It won't ever happen again because, after all, they promised it won't happen again.
That's like Hillary Clinton. I'm going to tell Wall Street to cut it out now. Cut it out.
Exactly. And it's like these Wall Street consent decrees where these banks admit that they committed these frauds. They promise not to do it again. At least the banks have to pony up some kind of money when they do it. There's been no repercussions for these kinds of frauds in the Democratic primary elections. There certainly should be a criminal investigation of what New York City did. It does seem strange that why is it that it seems like all of the voters who were disenfranchised, who were purged from the list, happen to just be Bernie Sanders supporters? Was there some coordination going on between the Board of Elections in New York City and whoever is running the van voter database for the DNC to make sure that it's likely Sanders voters who are targeted and wiped off the voting rolls? I have no idea. It's all speculation at this point because there's not a criminal investigation, and that's what we need. Otherwise, it creates what economists call a moral hazard, where it's creating incentives to just do this kind of wrongdoing again, these kinds of frauds again and again.